New Hampshire just passed a law that prevents the National Guard from being deployed overseas unless Congress declares war. That is not something we normally get anymore. We get endless wars with no actual declaration. So this is huge because it means the Pentagon can't just pull from these forces into wars of fancy without declaring war. And in order to declare war, you need elected representatives to vote on it. This was part of the project of Bring Our Troops Home. This is a group founded by Sergeant Dan McKnight, who served 13 years in the U.S. Marine Corps Reserves, U.S. Army, and the Idaho Army National Guard. So thank you so much for joining me.
You bet. Thanks for having me on.
Did I get that right? That now this means that at least in one state, they cannot pull from the National Reserves without a formal declaration. Let me know if I got anything wrong there and why this is so important.
No, that's pretty close. We're a third of the way through. We got through the New Hampshire House of Representatives, and now we go to the New Hampshire Senate. And if it passes there, then it will go to the governor's desk, where Governor Sununu will be forced to make a decision whether to align with the Constitution and the will of the representatives of the people, or to align with the uniparty in Washington, D.C. And we can't wait for that moment.
Okay, so can you just explain for anyone who may not be familiar with the military, the difference between the National Guard and active servicemen and why you're focusing on this component?
Absolutely. So the National Guard is, it's called the National Guard now, but it actually comes from the Constitution when it refers to the militia. It is the citizen soldiers, citizens that live their everyday lives as tradesmen and doctors and police officers and teachers. But on the weekends, they train in a military capacity to serve their state. They serve their state first, with the governor as the commander-in-chief, and then they serve their country with the president as the commander-in-chief under three situations, three circumstances. If we are under an invasion, they can be federalized to defend the country. If there is a domestic insurrection, they can be federalized to put down the insurrection, and they can be federalized to enforce the laws of the Union. Those are the only three times that the National Guard or the militia can be called into federal service. And the problem is that we don't use that anymore. We send them overseas to fight in undeclared wars, which is none of the three of the constitutionally enumerated purposes of the militia or the National Guard. And so the National Guard is not the reserves. It's a little bit different. The Army Reserve and the Air Force Reserve and the Navy Reserve, the Marine Corps Reserve, those are just like big Army, big Marines, active duty, but they only serve on the weekends. The National Guard is specific that it has dual enlistment. You are in the state militia and the federal military, depending on whose orders you're under.
Okay, so New Hampshire obviously is a small state, so maybe it's a symbolic victory, right? Do you hope that this will move throughout the nation? Why start there?
Absolutely. Well, we started actually in West Virginia. This will be the 10th year that Delegate Pat McGeehan, an Air Force Academy graduate and an Air Force officer, retired, multiple combat tours, he started the bill there about 10 years ago. And we picked it up as an organization in 2019. We got tired of fighting in Washington, D.C. All we want Congress to do is to do their job and declare war. And when we'd go to our congressmen and make that plea to them, they would take pictures with us and shake our hands and thank us for our service and maybe even put a little yellow ribbon on their lapel, but they would never do anything about the foreign policy. And so after Liz Cheney stared us in the eye and said that as long as she was in office, we would never come home from Afghanistan, we decided to take the fight back to a place where we had more leverage. Lift where you stand is kind of a motto that we follow. And the state militia, the National Guard, makes up about 50% of the active duty military fighting force. So if we could find a way to limit the ability to access half of their fighting force, we would have a fighting chance to change foreign policy. And by taking that piece off the battlefield, by making them do their job and declare war and put their name on the line before Idaho or New Hampshire or Texas National Guardsmen put their boots on the ground overseas, it puts things back in a right order.
I'm glad you mentioned Liz Cheney because her father, Dick Cheney, left us with this legacy called unitary executive theory. That was sort of a gift from him. Are you familiar with this?
I am.
And so for those of you who are not, holds that the president can override any law, treaty, or even parts of the Constitution to wage war in any way he sees fit, even without an official declaration of war by Congress. This, I believe, was how Obama just launched any war he wanted to without permission. So is this a hindrance to your efforts?
Only to those that don't believe the Constitution. I think the goal of Defend the Guard would be to get this passed and have some sort of a challenge pushed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has already opined on the use of the National Guard under federal service outside of the United States. They have said that the National Guard can and should serve in active capacity in foreign lands for the purposes of training. They purposely left out combat, though. They left it out of their decision because they thought the justices did, that it was pretty clear in the Constitution that the militia can be called forward to enforce the laws of the Union, and a declaration of war becomes the law of the Union. Dick Cheney and his theories are nothing more than that. They've never been tested or challenged. And by the 1/3 of the government, the representatives of the people in the legislature, in Congress, allowing the president to do that, they've abdicated their role and their responsibility to be our representatives and work on our behalf. And there's a handful of congressmen and a handful of senators, and it's getting smaller every day, that are standing up to that administrative power that the president's given himself.
So is it your opinion, to boil this down, that if Congress had to vote to authorize these wars and this law stood the test of the Supreme Court, then we would have fewer wars, because without this in place, they're playing pawns with lives? Do I read that right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The reason why Congress has abdicated their responsibility to declare war is because they're the ones that have to go home and justify to their constituents why they voted to send their sons and daughters off on some adventure in a third world country in the Middle East. Congress likes the ability for the president to unilaterally decide this. And the greatest, probably non-interventionist constitutional congressman we've had in the last 100 years, Ron Paul, actually put forward a declaration of war resolution before we went into Iraq. He proposed the declaration of war. He said he'd vote against it, his own resolution, but he said this is the way we should be doing it. And Congress basically laughed him out of the chambers. I don't even think it reached a vote. I think it was probably killed by motion. But Congress doesn't want to do that, because are you closer to your congressman or are you closer to the president? Well, the answer is obviously your congressman. The chance of running into your congressman at the grocery store or in your neighborhood or your church or kids going to the same school is pretty high. But the chance of actually ever engaging with the president of the United States is minuscule. It won't happen to most people in this country. And so that look you in the eye, tell you why we're fighting and sending and killing your children overseas, it doesn't have to happen at a personal level when Congress abdicates their authority.
Right. I love what you said in this 2021 Responsible Statecraft article. I think that many people forget that veterans usually lead the peace movements because they've seen for themselves that war is hell and should be avoided at all costs. What you write here is that any policy that prioritizes the demand of foreign populations over that of Americans cannot be described as intelligent. Worse, any policy that prioritizes endless war, overseas imperialism, and war profiteering cannot be described as moral. So which wars, you have a buffet to pick from right now that America is trying to get involved in. So if you're going to this buffet, I don't know, Ukraine, Somalia, Syria, Israel, now Libya, which one do you think concerns you the most right now that will escalate into costing American lives?
Israel. Israel and China are probably the two biggest wars right now that are the most terrifying. Ukraine is an interesting case study because we're fighting a war there. We're just doing it through proxy. We're sending all of our weapons, all of our money, all of our support to a country that I just saw that they're going to conscribe another 500,000 16 to 21-year-old Ukrainians to go die on the fronts against the Russian army. They're forcing a generation of Ukrainians to die for a cause that can't be won. We could send them all of our military arsenal, and they have no training. You can't just give a weapon to a 16-year-old inexperienced soldier and have them expect to be effective with it. So Ukraine's an interesting case study. It's one that we shouldn't be involved in. We've pushed that war. We've caused it with our expansion of NATO, and we need to get away from that kind of global expansionism. But the Israel conflict, or the war, let's call it what it is. Let's call it a spade a spade. The war with Hamas is terrifying just because of how deep the divide is between the sides, between Israel and Hamas. And then the Chinese conflict with Taiwan is so terrifying just because of the size of China and the economic power. And I don't think we even know where they're at economically. I don't think we have a really good estimation. But any of those three wars, or even Lebanon, or Iraq, or Djibouti, Africa, or anywhere else, if it's important enough for us to send treasure and blood, then it should be important enough for Congress to debate it thoughtfully, aggressively, and put their name on the line and declare it. If we're going to go to war and it's so important, let's do it the right way. Let's go with a clear path, a definition of victory, and a plan to come home.
Right. And we saw, when Representative Jamal Bowman was asked about the Donbass region, he didn't even know where that was. So he's not studying the wars that he is elected to represent. So something like this would mean that they would have to do some homework, just a little bit. And that is upsetting. I want to ask you about this because the lack of war declaration hurts the troops for many years to come. Now, a few years ago, I read a book called Social Security, Medicare, and Government Pensions. Not a page turner, but I learned that when veterans ask for compensation for Social Security and service-connected disability, rather, the rules are more lenient if they served during active war declared times. So putting this on the screen here, we see the times that they have done it just within the last 100 years. We have World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Persian Gulf War was the last time we got a formal declaration of war. So that means that anyone who's fought in, Libya, Somalia, Syria, Ukraine, if we do have boots on the ground, I believe, they don't fight under formally declared wars. So it won't be quite as easy for them to be cared for in their retirement. Is that right? So is that one of the many ways that we're sort of doing these people a disservice?
Yeah, there's a couple of distinctions there, and they are distinctions with a difference. The periods of time that you're talking about are periods that the VA has determined are worthy of special compensation and benefits packages. We have to be real careful when we use the word declared war, because we actually haven't declared war since 1942. The end of World War II against Algeria, Romania, and Bulgaria. That was the last time we actually declared war. So those specific periods you're talking about are special compensation periods that the VA and the Veterans Administration has put aside for special injuries, the burn pits in Iraq, for example. That's why the Iraq period is eligible. But
yes, Agent Orange, my stepfather
Orange
was exposed to that, and we know how the government fought back against any compensation for that.
Yep, absolutely. And we're seeing it right now with the global war on terror. The Veterans Administration just helped settle maybe the largest class action settlement for veterans in the history of the United States with the 3M dual flange hearing protection lawsuit, where veterans that were using these earplugs in combat that were supposed to protect our hearing, we all came home with tinnitus, and we've lost our hearing, and we finally settled this massive lawsuit. And I just got notified the other day that for all my tinnitus for the rest of my life and my hearing loss, which is about 40%, I'm going to get a check for about $4,000 one time. And you multiply that times the millions of people that have suffered during the global war on terror with this faulty equipment, and you see that it's not the government doing it; they're actually going after 3M, the manufacturer of the earplugs. But veterans do get taken care of. If you are injured in combat, whether it's been a declared war or not, this is one thing about the VA: they don't make a distinction. If you are service connected with your disability and it was done during a combat deployment or a foreign deployment, it is easier to get the benefits that you've earned.
Okay. All right. The distinction for the page of this book that I sent you said that it is easier, even if the injury or illness was completely unrelated to military duties, if you were serving in one of these declared time periods. So I was just wondering if anyone who've served not in one of these time periods would be harmed, even though they're putting their lives at risk just as much as
absolutely.
during, right?
Yeah, I can tell you, when we came home, I came home from Afghanistan in 2007, and there were no services available. PTSD was still not quite understood. The VA regional medical centers weren't ready for the influx of veterans that were coming home. And had there been a thoughtful debate and a declaration and an argument, an agreement on what victory looks like, we wouldn't have been there for 21 years. And so there wouldn't be millions of veterans coming home from the global war on terror. There would be a few dozen thousand, right? There might be 70, 80,000 that came home. So we've overwhelmed the system. And now we're seeing how much money they're pouring into the VA system. And we saw the VA problems that they had in Phoenix, where veterans were dying waiting for services when they came home from the war. sending millions and millions and millions of people to occupy Afghanistan and not fight for 20 years created a flood on the system that's untenable.
Right. And if you study the history of PTSD, that was specifically to diagnose veterans who felt like what they had seen was pointless. It's because they couldn't see why they had done that, why they had seen such horror, and they couldn't reconcile it with their real life. So the idea of a pointless war has this lasting effect on people who survive them. And so if we continue to wage pointless wars, we prolong this symptom, right?
Yeah, in the first 10 years of the war in Afghanistan, I was there in 2005, 6, and 7, which is really, really early in the war, which is kind of a weird thing to say, early in the war. But I was there, and we saw the strategy change. Every time a new general or a commander took over CENTCOM, the strategy would change. It went from shock and awe to winning the hearts and minds, to insurgency, to counterinsurgency, to projects, to the provincial reconstruction teams. And then eventually, right before we left, we were helping build water treatment facilities in schools that the next day or the next deployment coming in was destroying those same schools because they'd been taken over by the Taliban. And so an overwhelming majority of veterans that served there, and it was in the high 60% range, said that the war wasn't worth it because we didn't understand. And we should have been home in February of 2002. We landed on October 7th of 2001, 10/7. It's a day that'll live in infamy. When the first American boots hit the ground, the mission was accomplished. Everything had been done by February of 2002. But George Bush took his eye off the prize. Him and Dick Cheney wanted that war in Iraq so bad that they left us, they abandoned us for 2 decades in Afghanistan to go fight another war.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for bringing this to our attention. And we can support this movement at bringourtroopshome.us, right? And is there anywhere else
correct.
you'd like to direct our attention?
Yep. So bringourtroopshome.us is our organization's website. defendtheguard.us is if you want to find out specifically about the legislation. And if you go to defendtheguard.us, you can track each state. New Hampshire, we passed the House. Arizona, last year, we passed the Senate. In Texas, we are going to be on the ballot on March 5th for Republican voters to express their support for Defend the Guard during the presidential primary. And so if you click on the state you live in, you'll find your bill sponsor, and you can sign up to join the Army.
Amazing. All right. Thank you so much for this. I really support what you're doing, and I appreciate that. Please come back on Redacted as you bring this movement forward.
You bet. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.